You walked out quietly, no ultimatum, no dramatic monologue rehearsed in the bathroom mirror, no final, scorching speech that would have given them something to laugh about later. You simply left. And the world has a way of making quiet exits feel like defeat, like surrender, like proof of every cruel thing they whispered about you when they thought you were not listening. But here is what the silence after your departure revealed. The ground shook, not because you were loud, but because you were load-bearing. Every wall they leaned against had your fingerprints on it. Every ceiling that held was held in part by your refusal to let things collapse. And the moment you stopped holding, everything they had carefully balanced on top of your grace began to tremble. You did not know the full weight of what you carried. But they are learning it now, in real time. In the rattle of consequences, they can no longer redirect toward you. The house felt different when you walked into it, did it not? There was always a specific quality to that transition, the moment your key turned in the lock or your hand pushed open the door, where you scanned the air before you even removed your shoes. Not consciously, just instinctively, the way a soldier checks terrain. Your nervous system had been trained over years of emotional unpredictability to assess the temperature of a room before your body had fully entered it. And what you were met with more often than not was not warmth. It was not acknowledgement of your tiredness, your day, your quiet need to simply exist without performing. It was the same dull wall of preoccupation that said, without words, that your arrival had not registered as something worth celebrating. You learned to swallow that. You became expert at the small, practiced neutrality of pretending it did not cut. But it did cut. Every single time it cut, and the wound compounded like debt nobody acknowledged. There is a table I want you to remember. Maybe it was a holiday. Maybe it was a Tuesday. But you were seated among people who shared your last name or your history, surrounded by the smell of food and the sound of laughter, and you were completely invisible. You smiled at the right moment. You passed the right dish. You laughed exactly when the social script demanded it. And yet, somewhere beneath your sternum, a quiet grief was conducting itself in secret, a ceremony of mourning that no one at that table had any idea was happening inside the person sitting right beside them. You were there in body only. Your soul had retreated to a safer place, behind glass, watching the performance of togetherness with a kind of weary, bewildered ache, because you wanted it to be real. That was the cruelest part. You were not detached by choice. You were detached by survival, and no one noticed. Or if they noticed, they had long decided your feelings were inconvenient enough to ignore. That is why, in the trilogy, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, the link is in the pinned comment, I explain what they never taught you growing up. That the pain of being invisible in the very place that was supposed to see you most clearly is not a personal failure. It is a spiritual signal. It is the universe drawing a border in permanent ink, saying, you do not belong to this frequency. You were placed near it to fulfill a purpose, and that purpose is complete. Your discomfort was never a malfunction. It was always a compass. You stood in the shower and let the water take what your face could not, because in public in front of them, the tears would have been weaponized. They would have become evidence, proof of your instability, your oversensitivity, your dramatic nature. So you learned the discipline of the private grief. You mastered the art of crying in the only room where no one could turn your pain into ammunition. And while the water ran, something in the body remembered every moment it had been required to be stone. Your chest was tight, not from weakness, but from years of compression, from holding the shape of someone who did not need anything, so that the people around you would not feel burdened by your humanity. You compressed yourself into a version they could tolerate, and your cells held the memory of everything that compression cost you. The biologists call it allostatic load. God calls it a debt that is coming due, not to punish you, but to be released from you, to free the body that was never meant to carry it alone. And what do you think was happening inside the people seated at that same table when they watched you and felt not gratitude, not love, not appreciation, but irritation? Have you ever sat with that question honestly? Because the irritation they carried toward you was never really about you. Irritation is the emotional signature of exposure. When a person with unexamined wounds encounters someone whose depth, loyalty, and emotional honesty put their own shallowness on silent display, the ego responds the only way it knows how. It attacks. It minimizes. It reframes your gift as a defect. Your sensitivity became too much. Your discernment became paranoia. Your love became neediness. They handed you a diagnosis for your light because the alternative, acknowledging that your light existed and that they had failed to honor it, would have required a reckoning they were not yet equipped to face. It was easier to make you the problem than to become the solution. Every piece of so-called advice they offered you was a mirror they held backward. You need to toughen up. You care too much. You take everything too personally. These were not observations about your character. They were confessions about their limitations, dressed in the language of guidance. The people who are most aggressive about telling you to feel less are always the ones who have spent the longest time feeling nothing, or running from the things they feel. Their counsel was a kind of self-medication. If they could convince you to shrink, they could continue expanding without guilt. If they could get you to doubt your perception, their behavior would never have to answer to it. This is not new. This dynamic has played out across human history, in every family, in every village, in every circle where one person arrived carrying more light than the space was prepared to receive. Joseph knew this table. He sat at it too. He was the one whose dreams were too vivid, whose favor was too visible, whose future was too large for the room he had been placed in. His brothers did not hate him because he was bad. They hated him because he was different in a way that made their own ordinariness feel like a verdict. So they stripped the coat off his back and threw him into a pit and told their father a lie so clean it should have buried Joseph's story entirely. But the pit was not the end. The pit was the beginning, not despite the betrayal, but through it. Every hand that pushed him down became, without knowing it, a hand that positioned him for what was next. The rejection of his family became the foundation of his appointment. And the brothers who laughed, they eventually bowed, not out of performance, out of the undeniable gravitational truth that purpose cannot be permanently suppressed, no matter who is doing the suppressing. David was anointed in the field, while his father presented every other son first, because even the people closest to him did not see what God saw. He was an afterthought to his own bloodline. He had to fight a giant that an entire army was too afraid to face before anyone took his calling seriously. And Jesus, the one who walked on water, who wept at the grave of a friend, who turned over tables in the temple and held children in his arms in the same week, was called a blasphemer by the people who should have known better than anyone who he was. If you have ever been the one in the room that everyone else found difficult to categorize, the one who was too spiritual for the secular crowd and too real for the religious one, then you already understand something about what it costs to carry a light that does not fit the fixtures of the spaces you were placed in. You were not rejected because you were lacking. You were rejected because you were threatening. Not threatening in the way of danger, but threatening in the way that truth is threatening to a comfortable lie. Your presence alone posed a question that the people around you were not ready to answer honestly. And so they pushed, they minimized, they gathered in quiet consensus and decided that the problem was you. Because if the problem was you, they did not have to change. You absorbed their discomfort for years. You took on their diagnosis as though it were a fact, and in the loneliest hours, usually somewhere between midnight and dawn, you wondered if maybe they were right. That wondering, that midnight question, is the most dangerous battlefield a chosen one ever walks through, because it is not the rejection of others that truly breaks us. It is the moment we begin to agree with it. As I teach deeply in the material, the 3 keys to a prosperous life, I left the link for you in the pinned comment. This is the exact moment the adversary is counting on. Not the rejection itself, but your agreement with it. The agreement is what gives the wound its staying power. The agreement is what transforms someone else's projection into your own inner voice. And the inner voice is far more powerful than any external critic could ever be. This is why the work of reclaiming yourself is not about proving them wrong. It is about unagreeing with the lie at its root. It is about returning to the original knowledge of who you are before anyone's fear got to you. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs only to the light bearer. It is not the loneliness of being unloved. It is the loneliness of being loved incorrectly, of being held by hands that gripped instead of cradled, of being seen through a lens that was cracked before you ever arrived. You walk into rooms and people feel your energy before you speak. They are drawn to it, and depending on where they are in their own journey, they either lean into it gratefully or they recoil from it anxiously. The ones who recoil are the ones who labeled you. The ones who leaned in were the ones you protected, quietly, without ever asking for recognition. You were the calm at the center of their storms. You were the person they called at 2 in the morning. You were the one who stayed, not because you were weak, but because your capacity for loyalty was genuinely larger than anything they had reference for. But loyalty without reciprocity is not virtue. It is sacrifice without altar. And God does not require you to burn yourself down on behalf of people who will warm themselves at your ashes and walk away. There is a difference between being a light in darkness and being consumed by it. The candle that burns in a hurricane is not noble. It is extinguished. And the darkness it was supposed to illuminate remains unchanged. Your removal from environments that demanded your destruction without offering your restoration was not a failure of love. It was love at its most mature. The love that finally turns inward long enough to survive. What they lost when you left was not simply your presence. What they lost was an entire architecture of grace that you had been constructing around them for years, often without awareness, often at your own expense. Your patience had been absorbing consequences they should have faced. Your empathy had been softening the hard edges of their own behavior before those edges could cut the people around them. Your forgiveness had been creating enough breathing room for them to remain unchanged, because the cost of their staying the same was quietly being invoiced to you. The day you left, the invoice came due, and they had no currency to pay it. The arguments that used to resolve themselves because you were skilled at de-escalation did not resolve themselves anymore. The children, the friendships, the professional relationships that had benefited from your quiet, steadying influence began to show the fault lines that your grace had been papering over, not overnight. These things rarely collapse overnight. But slowly, the way a building with a compromised foundation begins to settle, a crack here, a leak there, a door that no longer closes correctly, the structure of what they had built on top of you began to reveal its instability. They looked around for someone to blame, and for the first time in a long time, you were not available to receive it. This is the divine order doing what it has always done. God does not rush. That is one of the most terrifying and most comforting truths about the way he operates. He does not rush, but he does not forget. Every dinner table where you were made invisible is on record. Every moment your loyalty was taken as permission for more imposition is on record. Every night you cried alone, every time you were called too much by people who were not nearly enough, every door closed in your face by hands that should have opened it, all of it catalogued with the precision of a divine accountant who has never once made a clerical error. You may have interpreted the silence of heaven during those seasons as absence. It was not absence, it was preparation. The refining process that you survived was not random suffering. It was the systematic removal of everything that was not native to your true identity. Grief burned away your need for their approval. Confusion burned away the false map you had been given for who you were supposed to be. Exhaustion burned away the performance of strength that had kept you from acknowledging you needed to be held too. What the fire left behind is what has always been irreducibly, inalienably you, a clarity of vision, a depth of empathy that has now been calibrated with wisdom instead of naivety, a loyalty that is now selective instead of indiscriminate, a tenderness that is no longer available for exploitation. They tried to use the fire to destroy you. They miscalculated its purifying properties entirely. There is a story in the ancient text of a woman who escaped the destruction of a city with her life and was given one instruction: do not look back. The city she left was burning. The life she was leaving behind was ending in fire. And she turned, not because she was foolish, but because the pull of the familiar, even when the familiar was destroying her, was stronger in that moment than the pull of the future she could not yet see. She turned, and she became a pillar of salt, permanent, preserved in the position of longing for what was already lost. And I want you to feel the weight of that image, because it is not just ancient history. It is the most accurate portrait of what happens to a chosen one who escapes the burning house but cannot stop looking back at the smoke. The versions of yourself that begged to be chosen by people who had already decided you were optional, do not go back for them. The relationship where you translated your soul into a language they were never interested in learning, do not reopen that door just because the silence of being without it feels unfamiliar. The family dynamic where you were the scapegoat, the too much, the difficult one, do not soften your boundaries just because someone recently decided, in a season of their own consequence, that they miss what they had when you were accessible. This is the test. The pillar of salt is not a punishment for missing what was lost. It is the anatomy of someone who let the gravitational pull of the past override the clarity of the present. You have come too far to calcify in that direction. The solitude you are sitting in right now, and I know it is real, I know it is heavy in a way that simple encouragement cannot immediately lift, is not the same as the loneliness you felt in rooms full of people. That loneliness was active. It was the pain of being surrounded by those who should have known you and experiencing in real time that they did not. This solitude is quieter. It is the space after the storm has passed. It is the field after a fire, black on the surface, but rich in the soil with everything the fire released. The seeds that grow in post-fire terrain are the ones built for the season ahead, not the season behind. You are in that field right now, and what grows here will not resemble what stood here before. The chains that your family carried across generations, the patterns of silence and shame, of smallness and performance, of love offered only conditionally and withdrawn strategically. Those chains were not manufactured in your lifetime. They were inherited, passed down with the furniture and the recipes and the last name, invisible to the naked eye, but perfectly legible to the nervous system of every child born into the system. You felt them before you had language for them. You carried them before you understood they were not yours. And when you began to feel the pull to set them down, when your awareness outpaced the unconscious agreement of the generations before you, the system perceived you as a threat. Because a chain is only a chain when everyone in it agrees to wear it. The moment one link refuses, the entire structure is put into question. Your refusal to continue the inheritance was never betrayal. It was liberation. And liberation, when it arrives in a bloodline for the first time, is rarely welcomed by the people who have organized their identity around the very captivity being interrupted. They will call it pride. They will call it selfishness. They will call it forgetting where you came from. None of those accusations are true. What is true is that you are the first person in a long line of people to lay down something heavy enough that the laying down felt like loss to those who never tried. And the generations that come after you, the children, the nieces and nephews, the ones not yet born, will inherit a different air because you refuse to keep breathing the old one. If you study the trilogy, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, which link is in the pinned comment, you will see that the breaking of generational cycles is never a solitary act of willpower. It is a spiritual event. It requires the kind of sustained inner work that most people avoid, because the grief involved in seeing your family clearly, not through the lens of what you needed them to be, but through the honest lens of what they actually were and were not capable of, is a grief that has no clean ending date. It does not resolve in a single session or a single cry. It layers, it surfaces in unexpected places. It asks you repeatedly to mourn the parents you deserved and did not have, the childhood that should have existed and did not, the belonging that was your birthright and was withheld. The mourning is not weakness. It is the passage through which your healing travels. God does not call you out of Egypt so that you can spend the rest of your life mentally returning to it. The Israelites wandered for 40 years in a distance that should have taken 11 days, and the theologians and the storytellers have offered many explanations for why. But here is the one that lands closest to the bone. Freedom is a geography that has to be learned. It is not simply a destination. It is a way of being that the mind must practice after years of being organized around captivity. You were not designed for the cage they built around you, but the cage was familiar, and familiar, even when it is painful, has a gravitational pull that the unfamiliar, even when it is good, must work to overcome. The 40 years in the wilderness is the time it takes to learn how to live without the walls you were handed. You are in that wilderness right now, and I need you to understand what the wilderness actually is, because it has been misrepresented. The wilderness is not a punishment, and it is not a waiting room. It is a formation. It is where Moses went from a man with a speech impediment and a complicated past to the individual through whom an entire nation's liberation moved. It is where David composed the songs that have sustained millions of people across millennia, while he was being hunted by the very king he had served faithfully. It is where Jesus himself was taken, immediately after the voice from heaven affirmed him, to be tested by everything that would attempt to redirect his identity and his purpose. The wilderness does not happen to broken people. It happens to people about to be entrusted with something significant. The people who are on their way to you are not like the people you left behind. They will not require you to become smaller to make them comfortable. They will not interpret your loyalty as an invitation to take more than was offered. They will not reframe your emotional depth as a character defect or your spiritual sensitivity as a liability. They are being prepared in their own season of wilderness in the same fire that refined you. And when your paths converge, and they will converge, because people who have been through the same kind of fire can recognize each other across a crowded room by the way they carry themselves, there will be a quality of recognition that is unlike anything you experienced in the spaces that rejected you. It will feel like a language you did not know you had been fluent in your entire life, finally being spoken back to you by someone who knows every word. The belonging you always craved was never supposed to come from the people who were intimidated by your light. That longing you carried for years, that ache for a place where you could exist fully, without editing, without performing a smaller version of yourself for the comfort of people who were not equipped to hold your actual size. That longing was accurate intelligence. It was not delusion. It was not evidence that you were asking for too much. It was the soul's orientation toward a future that had not yet arrived, and the people who could not meet it were not the destination. They were the curriculum. They taught you what recognition does not feel like, so that when real recognition arrives, you will not mistake it for something else. The curse was never on you. Let me say that again, so that every layer of your understanding can receive it. The curse was never on you. The difficulty you experienced was not divine punishment for being too much or not enough. It was not evidence that you were fundamentally unlovable, or that belonging was a gift reserved for other people. The dysfunction you were born into was not a verdict on your worth. It was a mission field you were assigned to pass through, not remain in. The people who named you difficult were describing their own incapacity. The people who called you too sensitive were confessing their own numbness. The people who excluded you were, in the vocabulary of the Spirit, unknowingly participating in your separation from what would have kept you small. Every closed door was God's open hand steering you forward. And now you stand at the threshold of the life that was always prepared for you. Not the consolation prize, not the adjusted for damage version, but the original design. The one sketched before the wounding, before the misidentification, before the years of carrying what was never yours. You are not damaged goods arriving late to a life you missed. You are a soul refined to a quality that ordinary comfort could never have produced, walking into a chapter that requires exactly the kind of person the fire made you. The scars are not liabilities. They are the autobiography of a survivor who became an overcomer. And that story, told from a place of healed wholeness rather than open wound, will reach the people who need it in a way that no polished, unweathered voice ever could. Rise, not for them, not in spite of them. Simply rise because you were designed for altitude. And the only thing that was ever keeping you at ground level was the accumulated weight of other people's fear dressed in the language of your failure. That weight is not yours. It never was. Set it down, all of it. The apology you kept rehearsing for existing too loudly. The explanations you prepared for having needs. The shame you wore for the crime of feeling things deeply in a family that had outlawed depth. Set it down at the threshold of this new beginning and walk through unencumbered. The life ahead does not have room for what you are releasing. Not because it is too small, but because it is too full of what is actually meant for you. Walk in. The curse they thought they placed on you, by removing you, by naming you difficult, by ensuring you felt optional in spaces where you were essential, that curse bounced. It returned to the source, the way all misdirected spiritual energy eventually does. And in your absence, they are sitting with something they do not have vocabulary for yet, the specific, irreplaceable quality of what your soul contributed to their lives, which no amount of replacement, distraction, or denial has been able to recreate. They are living in the echo of you, and you are living in the first quiet morning of a life that finally belongs entirely to yourself. They thought your absence would be your punishment. They did not understand it was your promotion. If you are ready to stop carrying the weight that was handed to you before you were old enough to refuse it, if you are ready to understand, at the level of the soul and the body and the practical reality of your daily life, why you went through what you went through and what it was building inside you, then the link to the 3 keys to a prosperous life is waiting for you in the pinned comment right now. This is not a program for people who have everything figured out. It is for the ones who are standing exactly where you are standing, at the edge of what was, looking out at what has not yet taken shape, knowing that something irreversible has shifted and that the next step matters more than any step before it. You were chosen before you were challenged. You were protected while you were being refined. And you are being guided right now toward the fullness of what was always waiting on the other side of the fire you walked through. The link is in the pinned comment. Take the next step.